Hello and welcome to another Wheel of Time diary, but this time not covering my actual reading of one of the books of the series. This time more of a kind of not quite review, sort of a review, but more of a roundup of the past few entries that I have read. If you recall from a little over a year ago at this point, probably around 14 months ago at the time of this video's release, approximately, give or take, when I finished reading the first 3 books of the Wheel of Time, those being the ones right there, Eye of the World, The Great Hunt, and The Dragon Reborn, I did a diary episode right after finishing The Dragon Reborn, basically just covering the topic of the quote-unquote first trilogy of the Wheel of Time as a whole, and not necessarily, like I said, the actual reading of any of the books. We're going to do the same thing now, except it's been, a couple of months since I finished reading Lord of Chaos, the 6th book in the series. Now I want to start off this video just kind of reviewing about how long I have spent reading the series up to this point. For the first trilogy, that being the first 3 books of the series, of course, I spent about 86 hours reading those 3 books combined, all things said and done. That is quite a long time, but it isn't quite the levels that the second trilogy managed to reach. Now, of course, the second trilogy of sorts, as we're going to be talking about them in this video, are The Shadow Rising, The Fires of Heaven, and Lord of Chaos. These are the next 3 books in the series, and all quite long books. In fact, The Shadow Rising and Lord of Chaos are the 2 longest books in the whole series, if I'm not mistaken. Alongside these 3 books, I also read New Spring in between books 5 and 6. So nothing too crazy to talk about there, except for how long I spent with this trilogy, not counting New Spring, so just Shadow Rising, Fires of Heaven, and Lord of Chaos. I spent about 123 and a half hours reading the trilogy, which is nearly 40 hours longer than I spent on the first 3 books. So even though I only got 3 books further in by technicality, by the normal timeline trajectory of the series, I spend a decent bit longer this time around. And if you include New Spring in there, which of course I am going to do for simplicity's sake, because this is when I read it, I spent 137 hours over approximately the last 11 months reading Wheel of Time. Now, of course, I didn't read these quite as quickly in between each other as I did the previous entries in the series, but that doesn't really make much difference. I still spent a considerable amount of time extra, a whole 51 hours more spent reading for these 4 books than with the first 3 books last year. Now, in terms of the enjoyment, did that extra length, that extra time spent, align with extra enjoyment at the end of the day? Unfortunately, I can't say that that was quite the case. It wasn't necessarily super far off from the case, but it also wasn't exactly the case either. The Shadow Rising, of course, the first book in the second trilogy, when the series really does start to come into its own, not just by my account, but by everybody's account, I gave this a 4 out of 5. I gave The Fires of Heaven, the middle book in this so-called trilogy, a 5 out of 5. I gave Lord of Chaos, similar to The Shadow Rising, also a 4 out of 5. And then New Spring kind of fell right in the middle there. I gave this 4.5 out of 5, which I think if I look back on it, it's a little bit more like a 4 out of 5, and that's what I gave it on Goodreads, but for all intents and purposes, it's kind of there in the middle. I really enjoyed this for what it was, despite it not being one of the main books in the series. This compares, of course, to my giving all 3 of these books back here. If I could make my finger go the right direction. It's a little bit harder in a mirrored camera. These 3 I all gave 5 out of 5s, so these ones don't necessarily quite hit the hype markers quite as well. Of course, if you follow along with the Wheel of Time diaries in the first place, which of course are my spoiler talk videos of when I'm reading any of these books, I go basically week by week, and I've been covering what I've read in that week, talked about some of the spoilers of it, and my general brief thoughts on all of that. I haven't loved these books quite as much as the first 3. I did have quite a fun time with them, as we'll discuss very shortly, but we'll just kind of jump right into that part now. the individual entries. What did I think of the individual books? If you want to know my specific thoughts, there are, of course, the other Wheel of Time diaries that I've done, but there are also spoiler-free reviews of all four of these books on the channel now as well. So if you want to know a little bit more in depth of what I thought about all of these, that is easily available. However, I do want to give just kind of a brief rundown of my thoughts on these books now that we're kind of moving on, and then next year we'll be moving forward into another era of the series. The Shadow Rising, which, like I said, I did give a 4 out of 5. I see why people love this so much, and I see mostly, for the most part, why it has the reputation that it does. I can see why it's a breaking point for the series as well, so there's kind of two sides of that story there. It is overall, for me, both overhyped and overhated at the same time. Of course, if you aren't a fan of Wheel of Time, you really aren't a fan of Wheel of Time. That's not necessarily anything new. There are people who just kind of bounce off the series from the very get-go, and I understand that. I do. I loved those first 3 books, but I understand why people wouldn't really enjoy them for those first couple of entries. The Shadow Rising is where people who are a little bit dubious, but not necessarily hating their time with the trilogy, either come to really love the series or come to really loathe the series. I know just as many people who have DNF'd in the Shadow Rising really did not enjoy their time, thought it was super bloated, and thus just kind of gave up. But there are just as many, if not more, people who have read The Shadow Rising and it been where they fell in love with the series, with sequences like Ruidian and stuff like that. A lot of the Io Waste stuff is really good. There's also Perrin's plotline in The Shadow Rising, which is fantastic. I see why people feel the way they do, whether it's good or bad for The Shadow Rising. I, for one, am a little bit less enthused with it compared to previous entries. I can see, like I said, why this would be a breaking point for some people, because it was also nearly a breaking point for one specific reason for me as well. Even though I was enjoying it overall, I just got really frustrated with one section, one character in particular, that sort of makes it hard to continue. So, like I said, I understand why people don't really want to continue by the time they've read part of this book, and it is when Jordan gets long-winded. As I said earlier in the video, this is one of the 2 longest books in the series. I think this one might actually be the longest, so no surprise there. The Fires of Heaven was a little bit of a different story for me. However, I really, really, really loved The Fires of Heaven, and frankly, I'm a little surprised this one has as many conflicting counts as it does. How many people kind of just don't really love this one, and then how many people also really love this one. But I think in general, this one sits in between The Shadow Rising and The Lord of Chaos, which are both really well hyped for the series, and this one's just kind of forgotten there in the middle trilogy. People either don't really think of it fondly because of like Nynaeve specifically, or the circus plotline. But overall, I just really loved my time with it. I heard a lot of conflicting things going into it, so I was worried about it. I was thinking that I would probably like it even less than The Shadow Rising, and it turned out being easily my favorite of this trilogy of sorts, and is tied for my favorite book in the series. Like the circus plotline and Nynaeve that I mentioned, both fine. I did not bounce off of those. I thought they were perfectly acceptable as they were. In fact, Nynaeve's character was really good and really interesting in this book, even if she could get borderline very annoying at a couple of points. The lack of Perrin and Zareen in this one really helped me as well, because I wasn't being bogged down by a character who I think is just pretty pointless. And the climax of The Fires of Heaven is just phenomenal. Even one of my friends who really did not like The Fires of Heaven overall thinks that the end is pretty great, and that is definitely true. If there's nothing that anybody likes about the first 3/4 or 4/5 of this book, they're going to like the end of it, because the end is just really cool, really epic, and has a lot of great moments going for it. The balance of the story and the pacing as well, the plot lines and whatnot, is overall the best in this second trilogy of sorts, in my opinion, as well. Doesn't feel like you're spending too much time with one character. It feels like any of the other storylines are missing, despite the fact that, ironically, Perrin and Zareen just literally do not exist in the book, and I think maybe got mentioned once or twice, and that was it. But yeah, then we move into Lord of Chaos, which is kind of similar to The Shadow Rising in that it gets a lot of praise and a lot of hype from a lot of people. And I also see why that is in this case, but in this case, I understand it a little bit more. The prologue is pretty epic and pretty cool, if just a little bit long. The end as well, which I thought or worried was going to be really overhyped, because that last chapter, Dumai's Wells, is talked about as one of the best moments of the entire series, definitely one of the best climaxes of the series according to most people, and I see why. Actually, I was really worried going into it, like, is this just going to be another case like the Shadow Rising, where I'm going to come to the end of the book and wonder why I spent as much time with it as I did, or rather wonder after the climax, just like, but why is that talked about as highly as it is? Even though the climax is not one of the things of the Shadow Rising that people talk about, it's mostly just the book as a whole. But I kind of felt that way about the book as a whole. Lord of Chaos is a little bit more mixed for me, however, because even though the end is really, really, really good, despite a little bit of contrivances that kind of make it feel a little bit easier than maybe it should have been in certain regards, I do feel like this is also a little bit overhyped, because this is where I personally felt like some of the more bloated aspects of the series are actually starting to appear. The Shadow Rising was a little bit slow paced for me throughout, part of the reason why it is, I think, so far my least favorite book in the series. But Lord of Chaos definitely had some more notable moments, some sections, the entire like middle portion, like the second third, we'll say, that just felt a little bit long and drawn out and boring. Not necessarily so boring as to be like, oh, I'm so bored reading this, but more like, can we kind of move on here, to the point where you're coming up to the last like 5 chapters of the book and you feel like you're reading a book, the very beginning of the book again, because of the way that certain arcs are planning out. And it's like, okay, but this just feels weird. The pacing of Lord of Chaos is just a little bit off for me overall. So even though the first one third, the setup of it is very good, and even though the last third of it, especially the climax itself, the last few chapters are actually really good and not overhyped at all, it does actually suffer from being a little bit more of Robert Jordan's long-winded self, and never really benefits from when he is forced to be a little bit more brief, where like The Great Hunt and Dragon Reborn both really benefit from the brevity that he is capable of. He never allows himself to be capable of that with this trilogy of sorts, and it actually kind of hurts certain aspects of it. Even though I loved Fires of Heaven, the other two definitely have some pretty heavy moments of that, and most people would argue that the circus plotline in Fires of Heaven suffers from that blow aspect as well. And then New Spring, which is a little bit of a different story. Again, I gave this one sort of a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I thought that this was a very good prequel in basically everything that I wanted it to be, what I had heard that it was sort of roughly about. From the very start of it, it's like, oh, this is the time period of when this is take place. This is the material it's covering. This makes perfect sense for a prequel to the Wheel of Time to cover, and I really enjoyed it. If there's anything about New Spring that I don't like, it's the fact that it's an incomplete prequel story. This was intended to be a trilogy of shorter novels. As far as I can tell, I know it was supposed to be a trilogy of these prequel stories. Whether all 3 of those were going to be closer to this length, who knows? But I really enjoyed it, and I mostly just feel like a lot of that prequel is missing, which of course it is, and I'm really sad that Jordan never got to finish this little prequel trilogy or the series as a whole. It would have been great to see some of that material. Despite that sort of incomplete feeling, which is a large part of why I actually kind of docked it half a star, the most major complaints about New Spring to me are pretty unfounded, like, say, the whole dress shopping chapter, as people kind of make it out to be a really big deal. It's just like, oh, it's one of the worst things in the whole series, and like, no, actually, it's not, and it is very plot relevant, so it isn't even a case of like, oh, George just spends too many words talking about things that don't matter, and that is not the case, and this is the shortest book in the series by a huge margin. Complaining about any of this being bloated, I think, is kind of unfounded in basically all respects. I blew through it for all intents and purposes. But for the trilogy as a whole, and as I've kind of already been talking about, it does have a lot of really great stuff. I don't think this trilogy holds up to me as much as the first trilogy does, even though Fires of Heaven is tied for my favorite book in the series. The other 2, and even if we're including New Spring, all fall pretty close to the bottom of my ranking at this point. So kind of what does the trilogy have going for it? I would say that this arc of the series has some of Rand's biggest moments, which are really cool. It has a lot of Matt starting to become his own person, a lot of his individuality and his character growth starting to happen, starting to show and poke through. That's also really awesome. It has a handful of really huge, momentous, and epic moments. You could even say the climax of The Shadow Rising is along these lines, but most especially Dumai's Wells, the climax of the Fires of Heaven are both really notable moments in this regard. The climax of Fires of Heaven especially feels pretty stand out as far as the scale of the series is concerned. It feels the biggest the series has been. Aside from the very end of The Dragon Reborn, I feel like the end of the Fires of Heaven is the biggest the series has gotten at this point. It also has some pretty emotionally impactful moments, which is not something that I would say Wheel of Time as a whole is really managing to achieve. The Perrin plotline in The Shadow Rising is basically the most primary example as far as this is concerned. There is a chapter in there which is very, very good and very well done in spite of Zareen existing, but that chapter is really emotionally impactful. Actually, that was pretty awesome to see a little bit more range in Robert Jordan's style. It has a couple characters who suck, however, and or basically just disappear, which is not quite as awesome. I've talked about Perrin and Zareen basically not existing in The Fires of Heaven, or rather, they literally do not exist in that book, and they essentially don't exist for like 80% or 85% of Lord of Chaos either, so that kind of feels weird. But the problem is that anywhere Perrin is, Zareen also is, aside from the last couple chapters of Lord of Chaos. And when those two are together, it's awful. So there's a little bit of downside to this. There's a lot of Forsaken stuff in the series, which is pretty awesome. You get a lot of political upheaval and maneuverings between different nations, especially as Rand is making his influence on the world, which is awesome. You get a lot of great magic, power, dynamic stuff, magical battles, such as with the girls in the Fires of Heaven, and the very end of Lord of Chaos, which is all really cool stuff. You get Rand also learning more of his powers through Forsaken, which is part of where a lot of the Forsaken stuff comes from, which is really cool as well. You also get a lot of that one character that I mentioned being terrible, and another character that I also mentioned really flailing to live up to what his potential was in the first trilogy, and those are basically the main downfalls. Just that character, that storyline has moments that are just kind of annoying, whereas the rest of it is still really epic. In conclusion, I'm still definitely in the Wheel of Time for the long haul after having spent what is the math at this point. I've spent 223 hours at this point reading the full series. So these 6 full books plus the prequel, which is a no small amount of time. I predict it'll probably be in approximately that same amount of time to read the rest of the series as well. And that'll take another year and a half or so, which kind of leads me into basically what the intent of this conclusion is, that not only am I in it for the long haul, but I also have pretty much a schedule of what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the books next year. There's a chance that the actual video schedule itself will switch up for a couple of these months, but when I'm reading the books is pretty much set in stone. I've scheduled the rest of my TBR more or less around that. In February of 2025, I'll be reading A Crown of Swords, the 7th book in the series, and those diary videos will be coming out on Thursdays. Path of Daggers will be in April of the same year, Winter's Heart, June, and Crossroads of Twilight in August. And right now, I'm planning for those 3 books for their diary episodes to come out on Sundays, opposite of Fortnight on the Isle. My bi-weekly update series obviously happens every couple of weeks on Sundays, so on the weeks opposite those in those months, April, June, and August, as I said, it's probably when those diaries are going to come out, and there's a couple reasons why I've chosen to kind of do that for those 3 books. I won't get into the details of it right now. I'll probably talk about that when I'm actually talking about Path of Daggers, but there's also the chance that I may just do Thursday episodes for those anyway. I haven't quite made up my mind yet. But then Knife of Dreams finally will also be in November of next year, so in just about a year from now, I will be through the remainder of RJ's output with Wheel of Time, and the diaries for that book will definitely be coming out on Thursdays. So that is basically the plan that I have for the rest of the year. or at least next year, with reading Wheel of Time, and then I'll figure out what my actual schedule for finishing the series with Brandon Sanderson's completion of it in 2026. That'll all happen in the first half of 2026 for sure, but we'll know a little bit more about that when I do another one of these videos after finishing Knife of Dreams. So probably in a little over a year's time, I'll have another diary talking about those 5 books together in kind of this manner. But I think I've gone on talking long enough. Those are kind of just my brief thoughts in some special manner, we'll say, for the purpose of consistency with the first trilogy of the series. I'm still really enjoying Wheel of Time. I still think it's great. People who tell you that I do not like The Shadow Rising are lying, by the way. That has become a kind of meme that has happened because of it being my least favorite in the series so far. It's still 4 out of 5. If you think 4 out of 5 is a bad score, that's a problem with you and not with me. But that's going to be the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you decide to stick around and check out more of these videos. If you've been following along with the Wheel of Time Diaries, rest assured I have plenty more other content happening on the channel that isn't just that series that is pretty good and that I enjoy doing. In fact, I'm going to be having 11 episodes of the book binge just this month alone, and I got to get into recording all of those right now, so I'm going to cut this one off here. Thank you for watching. Whatever the next video may be, which this time around is going to be the monthly reading wrap-up and TBR video in 2 days, I hope to see you guys there.